Hello and welcome to the second installment of the Money Matters webinar series. I'm Vanessa Laurel with Capacity for Health, and I will be the facilitator for today's session. This webinar is hosted by Capacity for Health, a project of the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum with offices in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. We are funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to provide free resources, trainings, webinars, and one-on-one tailored capacity building assistance in three main content areas. Today's webinar falls under the Organizational Infrastructure and Program Sustainability content area. We also do work in other areas such as evidence-based interventions and public health strategies and monitoring and evaluation. We are very pleased to have Lin-Sheng Liu join us today and present on the topic of financial stewardship. Lin-Sheng, will you go ahead and please introduce yourself?
Sure. Once again, thank you for tuning into this webinar. My name is Lin-Sheng Liu, and I work for Praxis Consulting Group. Praxis Consulting Group is an organizational development firm, and we work for mission-driven organizations. For us, that means nonprofits, employee-owned companies, and socially responsible businesses. We do everything from strategic planning to board development to leadership development to financial literacy training. I personally frequently work with board and staff members on financial literacy, management, and governance-related issues. This is part 2 of a 3-part series on financial literacy, financial governance, and financial management. So please check out the other 2 recorded webinars if you're interested. This webinar is directed both towards nonprofit staff and board members. We're first going to talk about financial stewardship in the larger context of the board's purpose. What does financial stewardship entail in the context of a nonprofit, and what roles and responsibilities must the board, committees, and staff fulfill? Then we'll spend the rest of this webinar sharing some practical tips on how to improve financial stewardship. So let's get started by taking a look at the bigger picture. So how does financial stewardship fit into the bigger picture of what the board's purpose is? So what is the board's ultimate responsibility? There's lots of different ways to phrase it, but the board should be directing the nonprofit towards realizing or accomplishing its mission. And part of that is making sure that financial resources are obtained and employed in the best way possible. That's financial governance. You may have noticed that I use the terms financial governance and financial stewardship interchangeably. Financial governance is probably the term that you'll hear more commonly in the field, but I like the phrase financial stewardship because it reflects the idea that board members are managing finances on behalf of someone else, and that's a big responsibility. For instance, you're going to feel a greater degree of accountability when you're borrowing a friend's car rather than driving your own, unless you really don't like your friend. In fact, board members have what's called a fiduciary responsibility for a nonprofit's financial resources. Fiduciary, once again, implies the idea of managing resources on behalf of another party. So board members are actually accountable for 2 specific duties. Firstly, they must exercise the duty of loyalty. That basically means the board members have to make decisions in the best interest of the organization. So, for example, a board member shouldn't require that his nonprofit contract with his wife's accounting firm for their audit without properly bidding out the job. The board members also need to exercise the duty of care, which means exercising reasonable care and due diligence. So attending board meetings, reading and understanding reports, and carefully considering decisions. To summarize all of that, to fulfill the fiduciary obligations, board members need to make well-informed decisions about finance that are in the best interest of the organization and its mission. So all of that was rather abstract, so it's more helpful sometimes to actually break down financial governance into concrete tasks. So I found it helpful to break it down in these following areas. The first area is accounting, compliance, and controls. None of the tasks that fall under this area are directly mission-related, but they're all absolutely critical. If you think back to that car analogy, accounting, compliance, and controls is about making sure if the car is working, right? Is the engine functional? Is the ignition working? Do the brakes work? Without these basics in place, you can't get anywhere safely. So likewise, in a nonprofit, the board needs to establish basic procedures and practices to ensure that, one, the nonprofit can get accurate financial information, 2, to prevent fraud, and 3, to comply with funding requirements and tax regulations. So this area includes things like making sure there are proper bookkeeping practices and document retention, making sure that you're complying with your funders and with state law, making sure you're filling out your Form 990. It also means getting an independent audit if that's something that's required by state or funding sources. And finally, making sure that there are adequate internal controls in place to prevent fraud. This last item is incredibly, incredibly important. You may know this already, but many fraud cases in both nonprofits and for-profits involve people that you have known for a long time, have worked for the organization for a long time, and that you generally like and trust. So for example, a former colleague of mine worked as a program officer at a religious foundation and was there for several years. During the entire time, the ED of the organization walked off with over $500,000. Eventually, she was discovered, and I believe she's serving out her penalty now, but the nonprofit had to close down. As the executive director, this individual had a lot of power, a lot of access to different financial systems, and the board just did not question her. So that's just one example, and it's fairly frequent in the news that we hear about nonprofit fraud cases, and there's also plenty of cases that go unreported or uninvestigated. So the best way to prevent this from happening is to implement good internal controls. For the most part, that isn't complicated. It's about making sure there's a separation of duties. So making sure that 2 people approve certain transactions and sign checks, making sure that the person who makes deposits into the bank isn't the same person that reconciles the bank statement at the end of the month. And it's also important for the board to review these procedures on a regular basis every couple of years, especially if the organization is growing and changing a lot. So the next area is short-term planning and monitoring. So this is about, going back to the car analogy, how to drive the car, right? Do you know how to steer? Do you know how to navigate traffic? Do you know how to use the brakes and the gas pedal? Most boards focus a lot of their time in this area, right? They approve budgets, they review financial reports in board meetings, but many board members struggle with doing this task meaningfully. It can be really difficult to really engage with the numbers on the page, right? How do you ask good questions about budgets or financial reports, and how do you provide helpful advice? So we'll talk about some practical tips for this area in just a little bit. The final area that the board needs to be involved in is setting a long-term financial strategy for the organization. What are the long-term financial goals for the nonprofit, given its mission and its environment? So the car analogy for this would be, where are you going? What's your destination? And how are you going to drive there? Boards that do this well are very proactive about addressing organizational risks and exploring new opportunities. They're doing assessments and studies to gather more information. They're always considering the financial implications of any decision. And these boards are also good at saying no. So if they have a really great idea for a program, but at the end of the day, after their analysis and research, it turns out that it's just not financially sustainable and the organization doesn't have the resources to support it, then these boards know how to turn it down. Boards that don't do this area quite as well have a tendency to ignore the current situation and to not think about the future. So they carry on with this business as usual mentality and tend to ignore problems until it's too late. Or boards can sometimes make decisions on impulse without thinking through the implications on finances. So common examples of this, nonprofits frequently will slowly draw down on their investment reserves over a period of time by running deficits year after year until there's no cash left. Even though they could have seen that problem coming many years in advance, many boards just don't have the impetus to actually do something about it. It also happens frequently that board members may approve a decision to buy a facility without thinking through how the organization is going to financially support the ongoing costs of owning a building. The bottom line is financial health generally supports mission success. The staff of the healthy financial organization is going to have better morale. They're going to have more time to think about their programs and outcomes rather than figuring out the next financial crisis, right? So how am I going to meet payroll tomorrow? Poor financial health, as you know, can also eventually result in the sudden shutdown of programs or even of the entire organization. So the board really needs to be setting a long-term strategy for financial sustainability. Now, you may have noticed so far that I've omitted one area in our discussion, and that's fundraising. I haven't forgotten about it. It is very important. It's not technically part of the financial oversight function, so I'll talk about it now, but won't be revisiting it for the rest of this webinar. But fundraising is still a critical responsibility of being a board member. If you go onto BoardSource and look up board responsibilities, it will include an item that says, ensure adequate financial resources for the organization. But that statement's a little bit vague, and you can interpret it in a lot of different ways. The responsibility has been taken to one extreme. I've seen a historic preservation organization draft a budget that had a shortfall. I forget the exact amount, but it was something significant, $100,000, $200,000. And this organization basically asked their board to fill in that gap, even though the board had no prior record of raising that much money. So that wasn't very helpful. It created a very adversarial relationship between the staff and the board. On the other extreme, there are some boards who don't take their responsibility to help with fundraising seriously enough at all. So these are board members that don't personally give money or lead the executive director and the staff entirely on their own for fundraising. So both staff and board need to be involved in making finances feasible and securing resources for the organization. The most helpful model I've seen implemented by fundraising consultants emphasizes that the entire board, so yes, every single individual on the board, needs to be engaged in securing resources for the nonprofit. That's part of their commitment and responsibility to the nonprofit. But being involved in fundraising doesn't always mean asking for money, right? It could mean being an ambassador and helping the nonprofit make connections in the community. It could be inviting a potential donor to a fun event or to take a tour of the facilities. It might be connecting the ED with a program officer at a foundation that the board member knows personally. Fundraising is about getting people to care about the organization and its work and building relationships, not about cold calling and asking for money. And finally, board members should contribute individually to the organization at a level that's meaningful, whether that's $5 or $5,000. 100% board participation in this area can also really send a strong message to other funders about the board's commitment and belief in the organization. There are a lot of boards that struggle with this area, and some of the things that people have found helpful to address that have involved perhaps putting a specific dollar amount around board giving and board-related fundraising, so having a goal that the board needs to reach, or creating a certain discretionary fund that the board can fundraise for, and then the board can have the flexibility to figure out how to use those funds to support the mission of the organization. Let the board be creative, take charge of a certain area, and as long as they're doing an activity that's going to support the organization, it ends up being very, very helpful. Another very practical thing that some organizations do is that they actually will, in their financial reports, break out board donations from regular individual giving. And this can often be helpful in raising more money because board members start feeling ashamed about how little they've given to the organization. So these are some of the different ways to involve the board more in fundraising. The important thing to keep in mind is that the relationship needs to be collaborative, right? It's a balance about challenging the board members to do more, but also addressing some of their fears and discomforts. So now that we've talked about all the tasks of financial governance, let's talk more specifically about the board and staff roles. Before I get into the detail, I do want to emphasize that nonprofits go through different life cycles. So the board ends up wearing different hats at different points in time. So for startup agencies or small agencies, boards are most likely in the active operational engagement mode. So that's just a fancy way of saying that they're probably rolling up their sleeves and involved in the day-to-day operations of the nonprofit. They might actually be drafting the budget, helping with bookkeeping, running to the bank to deposit checks. Whereas at a larger nonprofit, boards will be setting broader strategy and establishing policies for staff to follow. They're going to give guidelines to staff for what they can and cannot do. And the staff will probably have a fair amount of flexibility as to how exactly they're going to comply with those policies. The board is going to be overseeing and monitoring, but not involved in the day-to-day implementation. What I'm going to be talking about today relates more to the policy-based strategic partnership model, since that's most likely reflective of who's listening. But I will try to address the active operational engagement for those of you who are smaller or at startup nonprofits. And then obviously, please realize that this is a spectrum. So there may be boards that are somewhere in between or follow the active operational engagement in some moments, whereas they may be reflecting policy-based in other moments. I also want to say that everything I'm going to talk about relating to roles and responsibilities are guidelines or commonly used practices. I will use the term best practices from time to time, but I do want to be careful because sometimes best practices don't work in your situation. So if conforming to best practices doesn't work for your nonprofit, then try something else that makes more sense. Or if what you're doing now works and seems to be very effective, then there's no need to conform to so-called best practices. That being said, best practices can still be a helpful benchmark for you as you think about your board structure and roles. So this is a common organizational chart of a typical nonprofit. You have your board of directors up top as the responsible oversight body. Unless the organization is very small, the board isn't going to be doing all the work themselves. Most likely, they're going to hire an executive director, and they will delegate most of their responsibilities to the ED. The ED, in turn, if the organization is large enough, is then going to hire and oversee staff and further delegate tasks. All the financial stewardship responsibilities I talked about ultimately rest at the board level. But that doesn't mean they can't delegate those specific tasks to others, establish policies, and then oversee them. You'll also note that I have 3 board committees up. Most boards have committees that do the bulk of the work between formal board meetings. So investment, audit, finance committees are the most common committees that deal with money. I'm going to get into more detail about each of these committees in just a moment, but I do want to emphasize that these committees are in what's called an advisory role to the board. So their main purpose is to help the board make better decisions. The board can delegate some of its authority to make decisions to the committees. So for instance, the audit committee can select the auditor, but at the end of the day, the board still has full responsibility. So they should be aware and monitor the types of decisions that are being made in the committees. I also wanted to point out in this diagram that the solid lines are representing formal relationships, whereas dotted lines represent informal relationships, advisory or collaborative. Successful organizations don't just have strong capacity within each of these boxes, but also between boxes. How do people in these roles communicate with one another and work with one another? So I can think of an example where there's an organization that has a very, very talented ED that never communicates with the board, and as a result, lost opportunity for insight, advice, and support. So the extreme example that I'm thinking about is there's an executive director of a summer camp organization. He was a very, very talented, great manager, very charismatic, and successful fundraiser. And to no fault of his own, he actually lost a major funder. The funder was changing its funding priorities and decided that that organization didn't fit in that space. So instead of notifying the board about this change, the ED just assumed that he could make up the difference because he was such a fantastic fundraiser. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and that resulted in financial challenges for the nonprofit and his resignation as the ED. So that's obviously an extreme example, but I have seen other cases where there have been EDs or staff who have been reluctant to communicate to the board or to involve the board and gather their insight and advice. So when we talk about improving financial governance, it's not just about improving capacity within each of these boxes, but also about improving collaboration and communication between these boxes. So let's make sure we finish talking about all these boxes. So let's go on to talk a little bit more about the committees. So the Finance Committee's primary purpose should be to improve the board's ability to make well-informed decisions about finance. This can happen in a lot of different ways. The board can help with reporting. So that might mean that they're working with the staff to develop better reporting formats. One organization I've worked with had very complex financials. They had large multi-year projects. They had in-kind donations. They had non-operating dollars, and their finances were really, really hard to understand. So I worked with the Finance Committee and the staff to make a financial dashboard so that the information would be easier for the board to understand. The Finance Committee can also take a lead in reviewing financial controls and accounting practices. This could be a regular review of policies and procedures every couple of years if someone has expertise in the committee, or it could be working to hire a consultant that can do it, and then making sure that they report back to the board any concerns or inadequacies or changes that they made. Finance committees can also provide advice to the board, and this is where a lot of finance activity takes place. So this might mean doing a detailed analysis of financials of potential program expansion options. So maybe expanding a daycare program into the evening, or looking at the expansion options for a new healthcare facility. There's been a lot of really excellent work done in this area. So thoughtful spreadsheets, a lot of thorough research of cost and revenue options. I think the really important thing to emphasize about this area is to make sure that whatever the Finance Committee does, that they're able to transfer that knowledge to the rest of the board. So finance committees need to make sure that when they present their findings to the board, they're able to explain what their assumptions were, what kinds of concerns they have, and what are the risks. And finally, the Finance Committee can take a lead role in helping the rest of the board understand finance. So that can be as simple as providing a little extra context at board meetings. So one Finance Committee I worked with took 15 minutes during board meeting to explain a financial report. So they highlighted certain numbers and explained why they were important. They explained why certain numbers have changed from year to year. The Finance Committee can also look for more formal training opportunities. So they may want to explore potential workshops that the rest of the board can attend, or hire an external consultant to do a training, or try and do a formal training on their own. These two committees on this page are not always present in nonprofits. The Audit Committee is usually in charge of overseeing the auditor relationship. So they select the auditor and manage the relationship. In an ideal world, this committee should be separate from the Finance Committee. You don't want the people in charge of checking over internal controls to be the same people who set them up, right? You want to have an extra check and balance. But that's not always possible in practice. In fact, I've seen in a lot of boards, the Finance Committee will end up overseeing the audit. But if you can have separate committees and some separate people on those committees, that's always helpful. The Investment Committees oversee investments. That's usually an endowment for organizations that have large balances. So the Investment Committee will work to find an investment manager. They're going to figure out what's the appropriate risk level, and so on and so forth. Even if a nonprofit doesn't have an investment committee, the board is still responsible for making sure the nonprofit's cash or investment balances are securely and safely invested. But if the nonprofit doesn't have substantial balances, it may not require a separate committee to do it. But the board does need to make sure that the funds of the nonprofit are in FDIC insured bank accounts, or that they're safely invested in different with different investment managers. So both of these committees are still advisory, so the full board still has responsibility. So whatever the decision that the committees make, they still need to be able to explain and communicate the decision to the board, and in many cases require full board approval. Usually in the case of the Audit Committee, the final auditor meeting will usually take place with the full board. So I think in talking about all these committees, I didn't really talk explicitly about the treasurer role. So in general, the treasurer in an active operational board is often going to be actually assisting with bookkeeping and reporting. They're going to be the one who's doing all the hands-on finance work. Later on, treasurers generally act as the chair of the Finance Committee, or they may take an active role in making sure the board is fulfilling its financial oversight role. So the treasurer may make sure that the financial report presentation is included in the board agenda, and making sure that financial issues are being regularly discussed. So now that we've talked about the board, we can talk a little bit about staff and executive director responsibilities. The general idea is that the staff needs to accomplish goals within the guidelines and overall direction set by the board. In general, the executive director and senior leadership is going to collaborate with the board in setting larger strategic and financial goals. And then for the more day-to-day aspects of financial governance, the staff is going to comply with policies set by the board. Ideally, the board is going to set wide boundaries, and the ED and the staff are going to have flexibility to figure out what's the best way to fulfill them. And obviously, the staff should keep the board informed of any major financial developments. Sometimes staff or executive directors feel nervous about getting the board involved in any sort of decision that may not seem important enough for the board. So a lot of organizations have found it helpful to set some general guidelines so that board and staff kind of know how to think about this. So we finished talking about roles and responsibilities, so we wanted to get into some of the practical tips about improving financial governance. For many nonprofits that I've worked with or talked to, financial governance often comes up as an area that they really want to improve in. It's not an area that board members are generally strong in, so it's an incredibly important and critical area. So the first thing I want to say, improving this area is a process, right? It's not going to happen overnight, but it's helpful to identify what you need to work on and then slowly start to make progress over time. So this year, it might mean that you're revisiting your internal controls. Next year, you might try and clean up your board financial reports. And the year after that, maybe you're going to do formal financial literacy training for your board and start integrating finance into your strategic planning process. And this is hopefully something that the board chair or the finance committee chair can actively include for the board agenda. The first thing you want to make sure you do is that you establish a collaborative relationship between board and staff. The board is in an oversight position, but it often works best for the board to collaborate with the staff. The executive director shouldn't be left alone with the finance problems, but neither should the board make decisions without staff input. A good relationship is going to do a lot to facilitate better governance. Having that better relationship may mean explicitly discussing roles and responsibilities. So that could mean having a discussion about what's worked well and what hasn't worked well in the past and figuring out what changes are going to be made in the future. It may mean actually having a board and staff contract that outlines who's responsible for what and having very explicit policies around finance. It's also possible to conduct a board assessment or an organizational assessment or even just informally talk to some of your peers to hear what they're doing. That will help you further identify how you're going to improve this area and what are the areas that you need to work on. It may also help to talk openly with the board about what the board needs information-wise to make good decisions. And as I was saying earlier, set guidelines for communication between staff and board. And finally, it can be often helpful to get some additional training for both staff and board in order to help them work better in this area. The key in all of this is to be open and honest about where things are and how to move things forward. There's absolutely no shame in admitting that a board is weak in the area of financial governance. In fact, as I said earlier, a lot of organizations really struggle in this area. It's much better to just admit it and start to improve it rather than pretending that everything's okay. So I think I've alluded to previously that financial literacy is an area that a lot of board members struggle with. So that obviously raises the question, how much financial literacy should a board have? In an ideal world, every board member should be able to read the financial statements, read the financial reports, understand how they connect with the organization's programs, and be able to ask intelligent questions. Realistically, that's not always possible. There may always be one or two board members that, for various reasons, are simply not interested in learning finance to that level. Maybe they're on your board because they're an HIV expert or they're a representative from the community you serve. It's not ideal, but the important thing to make sure is that the board as a whole knows enough to exercise its fiduciary duty. So in plain language, you want to make sure that the majority of the board knows and understands finance. The risk that I see in a lot of boards is that only one or two people really understand the financials, and the rest of the board basically outsources their decision-making ability to those two people, and the board as a whole never exercises oversight. The risk with too little people knowing anything is obviously, first of all, fraud, but it's also missed opportunities and missed insight from other board members who may not understand the technical details of accounting and finance, but may still know a lot about improving your programs and your impact. So I would say if 8 out of your 10 board members exhibit reasonable knowledge of finance, then your board is probably okay. It may still benefit from a little additional training, but for the most part, the board is able to fulfill its obligations. But if only 2 of your board members really understand finance, and the other 8 rely on those 2 members, then that's a risky situation. The good news is there's actually a lot that can be done for improving financial literacy. On one hand, simply improving your reports and the way they're presented can make a huge difference. I think I said this in my earlier webinar, but I've seen reports where they're literally, 20 or 30 columns wide, maybe 100 lines, and you have to tape together 8 pieces of paper in order to read them. So obviously no board member, even one that knows finance, is really going to be able to dig through all those numbers. So the best financial reports to the board are going to present the big picture financials. And many organizations find it really helpful to provide additional narrative context and highlights. So that might mean having a finance committee or a staff member providing some extra explanation at a board meeting, or it could be a short paragraph attached to the report that's going to highlight kind of key financial changes or developments. Another fun way that I've seen this presented is to actually make reading financial reports a little mini game. So you divide the room into teams, and then you start asking people questions. So what's the biggest change in revenue from this year to last year? What's our biggest asset and why? And then you can have the two teams compete, but at the same time it forces people to really read the financials and think about them. It's also helpful to have basic training, so it's possible to have a basic training session on finance at a board meeting, or you could do 15-minute quick lessons throughout the year. So at each board meeting you'd spend 15 minutes talking about restrictions or allocations or depreciation. There's also an earlier webinar that I've done that's hosted on API-AHF on basic financial literacy. So that's something that you could also send out to board members so that they can listen in and learn more. Improving financial literacy and tying it to the programs can make a huge difference. It really empowers board members because it really lets them connect their existing experience and knowledge to financial matters. So not everyone can do accounting or make fancy spreadsheets, but everyone can have good ideas about cost reductions, revenue opportunities, and program priorities. And being able to connect the non-number-based knowledge with the numbers is very, very powerful. Now, as we said earlier, financial governance is ultimately about supporting your mission and program. So there's a lot of different elements for making sure that you're going in that direction. So you have a functional car, and now you need to know where you're going and how you're going to get there. That's your financial strategy. And you also need to know how to drive. That's going to be the more regular budgeting and monitoring, navigating the near term in order to get where you want to be in the future. So let's talk about some practical ways to improve board effectiveness in each of these areas. So the first piece is, how do you go about setting long-term financial strategy or long-term financial goals? And first of all, well, what are they? So in general, long-term financial goals are 3 to 5 to 10-year goals relating to finance. They're generally not that complicated. It could be having a 3-month saving reserve or having a capital reserve so that you can replace and make improvements on your building in the future. Or it could mean growing individual giving by 20%. It's important that you're able to link those long-term financial goals to your mission and program. So it may mean stating that savings goal, but saying that the purpose of having the savings goal is to make sure that you have a cushion for emergency situations. The reason that you need to have a capital reserve is that your facility is critical for service delivery, and you want to make sure that you can provide quality service, which entails quality facilities. And then finally, you may want to increase your individual giving because you want to be less dependent on foundation grants. So there are many practical ways that you can integrate this into your regular planning. The strategic plan is obviously a natural entry point, so people will use financial planning as a feasibility check on their goals or as part of their implementation planning. People will often have a chance to research funders and talk to other stakeholders in the strategic planning process, and that may identify certain revenue opportunities or cost-saving opportunities. It can also be helpful to address financial strategy apart from a strategic planning process. And there's lots of practical ways that you can do this. So one way is to actually do a historical assessment. So having a financial report presented to the board that has 3 to 5 years of financial information, maybe a couple of graphs, and then looking over this once every couple of years in order to kind of examine what are some of the trends. Taking the time to do this can reveal a lot of critical issues or it can bring issues that people were aware of but weren't readily willing to admit or really deal with into more focus. So for instance, in doing one of these historical assessments, a community organizing agency that relied heavily on foundation support realizes that they really needed to be able to reach out and build some financial support from the community because they were so reliant on these large foundation grants. For another board that I worked with, it meant acknowledging and figuring out an action plan for addressing serial deficits. This was a private school, and they had falling enrollment for multiple years. And by doing this historical assessment and putting the data in front of the board, they really couldn't deny it, right? They really had to take the time to talk about it and start discussing some strategies to address it. It can also be really helpful to do a peer comparison. So the 990s on GuideStar is a helpful starting point, and some sectors also have some central sources for financial information. So in doing a peer comparison, a dance company realized that they actually had very solid earned revenue from their dance classes, but that they had not fully tapped into philanthropic resources in the region, both individuals and foundations. Another nonprofit lending institution that we worked with, the board realized that the loan delinquencies were far higher than the industry average. So there's a lot of very useful insights that can come out of doing these exercises, and it may also add a little bit more energy to some of your board members to be able to do some financial analysis and then talk about your programs and your organization as a whole. Another exercise that helps you connect finance better with mission is this dual bottom line matrix that's from a book called Financial Leadership for Nonprofit Executives, written by Jeannie Bell and Elizabeth Schaefer. It's an excellent book, so I recommend that you look into it. But the basic idea of this diagram is that on the x-axis, you have financial sustainability, and then on the y-axis, you have your mission impact. So you can map your programs onto this matrix. So the STAR programs are obviously the ones that we would all love to have, right? They're both financially sustainable and they have high mission impact. The HEART programs are the programs that are very, very critical to your mission. Maybe it's your free HIV testing or your education programs, but they're really not that financially sustainable on their own. Yet you need to have them because they're mission critical. Dollar programs are tricky, right? They seem wonderful, right? These are programs that may not be as closely mission related, but they really are able to secure a lot of financial resources for your organization. I think the danger with some of these programs is that they can eventually draw the organization away from its mission and cause mission drift. So one organization that I worked with once was doing after-school confidence-building education programs. This was, and that was kind of their specialty. And then over time, they started receiving some case management work where they were working with adolescents out of juvenile detention. So this started to grow a lot. It was a dollar program, so it was very financially successful, but it grew to be so large that it started to overshadow their other educational programs. The case management money is now starting to dry up. So the organization is now dealing with the dual challenge of having declining revenue, but also needing to reinvent itself and rebrand itself because they're now known for case management rather than after-school programs. So, and finally, I forgot to mention that the question mark programs are the ones that have neither mission impact nor financial sustainability, but for some reason they're still around in the organization, perhaps because it's something that the nonprofit has always done. So the board can actually map their programs onto this matrix and then brainstorm ways to make some programs more financially sustainable and to make other programs more mission aligned. So the finance committee or the CFO may have a good program profitability analysis that you can use, and the mission impact assessment can be done with the board or the staff, or it can be done with a wider community of stakeholders. So this is an activity that the board can do in the context of a strategic plan, or it could be part of a regular annual review of programs. And talking about this can help bring out some more financial and programmatic goals. So once there are long-term goals, the budgeting process is a lot easier. Oftentimes in budgeting process, boards can micromanage or nitpick. They start focusing on some of the small items. So, why has this number gone up by 2,000 from last year to this year? Or they end up rubber stamping budgets. So there's no real input, or they don't really take the time to really read and understand it. the best way for the board to be involved in the budgeting process is actually to set broad guidelines for the budget. So this might mean savings goals, program priorities, new areas of investment, and then to give staff the flexibility to set the budget within those areas. That way the board isn't micromanaging or nitpicking, but the board is still providing general direction for the staff about how to think about the budget. So for instance, if a long-term financial goal of the organization is to establish 3 months of savings, maybe this year the board's goal is to save 1 month of savings in the budget. Or it may mean that the board wants to invest in a certain education program. So the board lets the staff know that if there are any extra financial resources, they should go into the education program. Or it could mean that the board decides this year the organization is going to run a deficit because it's a year where their revenue is going to be down because the economy is not doing well, but there's still going to be a very high demand for services, and the board wants to make sure they can still meet those services. So once the board sets those guidelines, the staff can work out the details of how to create the budget within those guidelines, and then obviously discuss with the board if those guidelines are unrealistic. Hopefully, if the board is adequately in tune with the nonprofit, the goals are going to be feasible. Another way that the board may be involved in the budgeting process is they may work with the staff to determine other planning documents that are going to be helpful. So this could be a capital plan, which is usually anywhere from 1 to 5 to 10 years of types of capital investments that you want to make, so building improvements, equipment purchases, and so on. It could be asking the staff to create scenario budgets. So especially as there's so much uncertainty about funding, an organization may want to have more than one budget so that if certain things happen, they're able to revert to a different budget and not have to do the planning all over again. It may also mean having cash flow projections to be able to navigate the kind of ebbs and flows in cash throughout the year. The key in this area is to make sure that the board is not burdening the staff with too much, but really thinking thoughtfully about what's going to be important for the organization to have, given its size, given the environment, and so on. And then finally, the board may want to establish policies for how staff can deviate from the budget throughout the year. This doesn't need to be done annually, but it's something to have in place so the staff has something to guide them. So what I mean by this is that the board may want to establish a policy for how large a variance can the staff run before they need to notify the board. Or if there's some flexibility to move funds from one area to another, how big a transfer can staff do on their own without having to draft a revised budget for approval? So once the budget is in place, the board obviously still needs to monitor regularly. The finance committee may want to try to monitor monthly, whereas the full board may want to monitor at their quarterly meetings, because as we know, plans don't always go as planned. The thing that I'll emphasize about good monitoring is that it requires a strong knowledge of the environment. A lot of times, critical issues that are going to affect the organization don't show up immediately in the numbers. So it's important for board members to really think about what's going on externally and internally to the organization, and then figure out and try to determine if that's going to affect the numbers either in the future or if the impact is already present. Other important things to remember for monitoring is obviously to have a good budget, to have reliable financial information, and obviously to have an adequate level of financial literacy. So as the board monitors, either things are going to look okay or they're going to start seeing some things that are strange. So one possibility is that the numbers just don't look right. Something seems fishy. The organization's cash is dwindling, but it's been reporting surpluses for the past few years. There could be a very good explanation for that. It could be timing, accounting software limitations, but it could also be accounting error or a case of fraud. So the board will want to investigate why. So it might just be an accounting error, in which case it's important to fix it, revise your financials, and then work to prevent it in the future. Or it could be a case of fraud, in which case there may be a more complex investigation process. So the board may want to gather evidence quietly, look for altered documents, missing documentation, forged signature, notify authorities if that's the final verdict of their investigations. In general, the executive director can oversee that investigation process if it's an employee that's suspected of committing fraud. Whereas if the executive director is the one who's suspect, the chair may want to oversee that process. If it is a case of fraud, it's really, really important to have an appropriate communication strategy afterwards. My personal opinion is please don't cover it up, especially if it involves either large amounts of money or senior leadership. It can be tempting for boards at times to cover up these incidents. It's embarrassing to admit that something happened right under your nose or under your watch. But word usually gets out sooner or later. So I think it's better to be transparent, to admit your mistakes, and then communicate the steps that you're taking to correct it. I believe that it's actually a huge disservice to your stakeholders if you're not honest. So that's kind of the framework for dealing with either accounting error or fraud in your organization. But hopefully in most cases and in most monitoring circumstances, this isn't going to be the case. Most likely you're just not meeting your budget targets. So either revenue is lower than what you've budgeted or costs are much higher than expected. In this case, in some ways it's a similar principle, right? The first thing you want to do is figure out why. Because it could just be seasonality. Maybe cash and revenue are just low in the summer, and so are your patient visits. Or it could be the beginning of a chronic problem. So maybe there's declining revenue because of reduced state and federal support. Or it could just be a one-time event. Maybe there was damage to a water boiler that you had to repair immediately. So once the board has a good sense of the cause, it needs to ask itself what the impact will be short and long term. So in the short term, will the nonprofit have to draw down on cash reserves, or will the nonprofit have to borrow money? And then what will be the long-term impact? So will there be enough remaining cash for future emergencies? Or will the nonprofit be able to repay the loan? Will the lower revenue cause additional stress on your staff? Or will this declining revenue eventually lead to the loss of a critical program? So there's lots of different short and long-term impacts that the board may realize these changes will lead to. Once the board has a sense of how big the impact will be and what the cause is, the board needs to figure out what needs to be done. It might actually be nothing if it's just a case of seasonality, right? Or it might just be a minor revision to the budget if it turns out that revenue is just a little lower than projected, but the board thinks it's appropriate to draw down on cash reserves. Or it could be something more major. So maybe if a nonprofit lost a major funder, it's time to have immediate cost freezes. Or maybe if the board has a backup or scenario budget for the year, it may mean reverting to that backup budget, or it could mean having a staff furlough or something drastic. On the other hand, if it's a symptom of a long-term trend, such as permanently decreasing federal and state revenue, the board may actually need to revisit its long-term goals relating to finance. If the organization can no longer rely on government support, the board may really need to take some time to think about where else or how else the organization can be financially supported. So to wrap up this webinar, I wanted to provide a couple additional resources for financial governance. So they're listed up here. There's a whole bunch of excellent books as well as excellent websites that you can look at. In the end of the day, the purpose of financial governance is to support financial sustainability and mission success for your nonprofit. It's an ongoing process. It's going to require regular maintenance and revisiting, but it is a critical responsibility of the board. So I hope that today has given you a better idea of what financial governance entails and has given you some practical ideas about how you can make improvements in this area. Thank you again for listening to this webinar, and I hope that, as I said before, that you find this helpful and valuable.
Thank you, Lynn Shang. I'm just going to go over a couple of things and wrap things up for this webinar. Slides and related resources will be available on the Capacity for Health website at www.capacityforhealth.org. You can also find and register for upcoming webinars and trainings by going to our upcoming trainings and webinars page. Of course, feel free to contact us for any of your capacity building assistance needs. There is our phone number right there. It's 415-568-3308, and you may also reach us via email at c4h@apiahf.org. One of the many ways that you can keep in touch with us is by signing up for our mailing list. The address is right there. You just click on that link. And as I mentioned previously, Capacity for Health is funded by CDC to provide free capacity building assistance in a number of different areas. Thank you for accessing this webinar, and we hope to hear from you soon.